Welcome to Chapter 4 of Law Enforcement Today. We're going to be looking today at beginning our examination of the police. Uh, Broadly, this book is divided into really 5 sections. The first is the introductory sections that we went through. The second and one of the largest core sections is about the police or law enforcement, which we're going to handle starting today. The next section is about the court system. The fourth section is going to be about the penal or the correctional system, and then we have some catch-all chapters at the end that we'll talk about. But today we're going to focus on law enforcement today. And if we could just go here, okay. What do the police do? Well, again, early in these lectures, we had introduced the concept of chronocentrism, that is, the belief that what is going on in your time is correct and is normal, and ethnocentrism, the idea that what is normal is what is your experience. So one of the areas in which we're going to be able to examine those concepts, and they kind of run throughout the course, is the responsibilities of the police. So your book states that broadly the responsibilities of police fall into these 4 areas, at least at first. Enforcing the law, and this is kind of, if you want to date yourself, or I'll date myself, the old Joe Friday from Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am. The police really just enforce the laws. In fact, that's not a lot of what they do. Provide services. Now, this is something they very much do as they interact with the population. Preventing crime. This is the idealized part of what we expect the police to do. And then finally, preserving the peace, which is a much broader term than that might first suggest to you. It can include all sorts of things. Okay, so let's talk about a short history of the American policing, and this goes back to our concept of chronocentrism and ethnocentrism. Crime control was not the primary focus of early American police departments. Okay, so when early American police departments first developed, it was the formal ones that we have today. It's actually the mid to late 1800s. Now, there were precursors to this. Part of the precursors was the night watch system that the English colonists brought over, primarily only for cities or towns. Remember, most of the population didn't live in cities, certainly. And it's really not until population growth in the United States and across the world, examples of the world like London, really accelerates that we need a formal police force. Some of the early police departments, and there's going to be some contention between the big police departments as to who was first, but Philadelphia had a watch system as early as the 1830s, and Boston had a police department, again, some dispute about this, as early as 1838. By the Civil War, many cities, particularly since most of these cities are concentrated north, many northern cities, New York, Philadelphia, Boston being the really important ones, but there were others, had police departments. Most of these police departments took as their model the Metropolitan Police of London, what most Americans think of as Scotland Yard. This was a highly politicized police department. Most American governmental functions were deeply intertwined with the major political parties of the time. So that would include the Democratic Party, which is still the same Democratic Party we had today, the Whig Party, eventually the party which replaced the Whig Party, which was the Republican Party in the 1860s. But one of the things that went on with the police was when a new political party or even a faction of that political party came in and took over. So a famous faction of political party was Tammany Hall in New York City. But these could exist even in quasi-rural environments as late as the 1940s. For example, you could look at the Pendergrast political machine in Missouri. Um, they were centered around using the police as part of the patronage system. So when your guys got elected, you had the power to give your supporters in your political party jobs. You could also hire not only your party, but you could promote people that were already had jobs. And of course, they were expected to reciprocate and support the party back. Gradually, this was seen, and this is around the turn of the century, around 1900, we'll say. This was seen as a problem, and some important figures, including the Berkeley chief of police, really decided that we needed to professionalize the police. So a professional model of policing was pushed. And gradually, as opposed to politicians running the police, police chiefs took control of their department. We saw a definite increase in the salary and the working conditions, although this wasn't uniform across the United States. It was more slowly implemented in some places. We saw more women and minorities hired, and again, this took quite a bit of time. Some departments were more progressive, such as Los Angeles and New York City. Others were a little bit slower, like, say, Miami or New Orleans. There was very little focus on public relations. In fact, there was at least some strain that believed you could remove the police from the community, and that would protect them from corruption. And this existed at all levels, this idea. For example, the Federal Bureau of Investigations for years, under J. Edgar Hoover, conducted very few direct investigations of the mafia. And I think that was in part because Hoover was afraid that it would contaminate the FBI, that it would make them corrupt if they kind of integrated and really became more parts of the community. Now, this had serious benefits, but it also had very serious drawbacks. As the police were removed from the general population, as the blue wall forms, the public fails to identify with the police. The public begins not to support the police. So by the time the civil rights movement in the 1960s comes around, there is an open hostility between much of the civil rights movement and the police departments, and even the federal police departments. So we see, for example, the FBI conduct undercover operations against the civil rights movement. They famously wiretapped Martin Luther King. They tried to induce him to commit suicide. They investigated and planted evidence against political movements like the Black Panthers. Gradually, the solution to this hostility between the population and the police was the community policing era. And police departments began to reach out to the local communities and kind of seek more support from them. So they wanted to break down the blue wall a little bit. Now, today, there are some unique challenges. We'll talk about intelligence, terrorism, and technology. When 9/11 occurred, almost 2 decades ago now, community policing was clearly the dominant idea. And if you look at what they were focused on, they were not focused on intelligence, they were not focused on terrorism, and technology was being utilized, but it wasn't as important. So you could look, for example, at the manpower that, again, the FBI was devoting to international terrorism, and it wouldn't be very high. But post 9/11, a tremendous amount of information it becomes available and utilized by the police. The collecting, the analyzing, the mapping of this data. There's also a great emphasis on counterterrorism, so that the FBI devotes a lot of its resources now to counterterrorism, which includes things like surveillance and technology. Okay, so intelligence-led policing. You see on popular TV programs, it's very common for a police officer to say something like, "Oh, my gut tells me that this guy's guilty," or "These are my feelings about something." And this harkens back to the older model of policing, a very informalized model. Gradually, what we've found is that we can apply scientific techniques to policing. Most critically, we can use scientific data that we gather to predict future crime patterns and prevent crime and arrest people. So a classic example of this was done in Montreal. They did a study about certain types of serial rapists. And whereas the sort of gut reaction of police would be that in order not to be detected, rapists would travel outside of the area they lived, so where they would be able to go someplace where they had anonymity, where they weren't recognized, and then they would commit their crimes there. And in fact, by studying past rapes and past arrest for rape victims, what we found was, what the Montreal study found was that in fact, rapists of this type function very much like predatory animals. So a predatory animal has a definite territory within which it operates. And why is this useful for the police? Well, if you know that if a series of rapes are occurring, that the perpetrator will live within or work within a short geographical distance from where the rapes are occurring, which is counterintuitive to what we believed previously, then you can focus your resources on those people. And you can more readily identify and apprehend, preventing future rapes, preventing future crimes. So you can be more effective. You can deploy your resources, and all resources are limited, in a more effective way to both prevent crime and to catch the people who commit crimes. Let's talk about counterterrorism a little. 9/11 was a great shock, of course. Thousands of Americans were killed, and the amount of resources that was devoted to that was really astounding. And we had to essentially say, even though these crimes are very rare, and major terrorist attacks are very rare in comparison to things like street crime, we need to devote a disproportionate amount of resources to them. First of all, I think because the public expects it. We very often act as a public and expect our emotional needs to be met over perhaps our rational needs. So we devoted a lot of resources to counterterrorism. And part of this is gathering information about crimes before they're happening. And we can do this with both hard and soft power, and we'll talk about that. Beyond intelligence gathering and terrorism, counterterrorism, we did begin to deploy in law enforcement better technology and better intelligence. So it could be something as simple as the deployment of cameras. Now, we'd always had some cameras, but they were primarily limited by film. But now, with video feeds, we have, particularly in the major cities like New York, Boston to some extent, many of the public spaces in those cities and others are under closed-circuit TV 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And this can help us both solve crimes and operate as a deterrent against crime. Okay, if you want to be a police officer, what are your basic requirements? Well, first of all, police officers must be U.S. citizens. They generally cannot have any felony convictions. They must have a driver's license because a lot of what they do initially is patrol. 21 years of age. There are height and weight requirements, and this is height, weight, and eyesight requirements. This is basic physical fitness. There can be other conditions. Each department can request or can set criteria. For example, Raleigh Police Department might set a criteria of, well, we're not going to hire someone who's not a high school education. That goes to an educational requirement. Or we're going to have a preference for people that, in Raleigh, for example, you can't be promoted above master officer, which is essentially corporal, without a 2-year degree. There's going to be background checks. You're going to do, for example, again, Raleigh Police Department will do a criminal records check to make sure that you don't indeed have any serious convictions. And they're going to do testing, and some of these are physical tests. There's a lie detector component to it. There'll be written exams. There'll be physical exams. They'll also do a credit check, for example, because the police departments tend to believe that individuals who don't have good credit are more susceptible to corruption, taking bribes. Okay, training. There's really two major components of this. Once you get through the application process, you're going to go through some sort of training. Now, this can be much more formal in some departments than others. And in many police departments, there are formal police academies that look very much like military academies. Sometimes cadets might actually live there. Sometimes they'll spend a lot of time there. The Raleigh Police Academy is located off of Capitol Boulevard, and it's named after Baker, who was the first black officer to serve in the Raleigh Police Department. And candidates will go there from early in the morning till late in the afternoon. There is a very extensive course that they take, and Raleigh will graduate you and will pay you a salary. You will be paid as a police officer during some very long training. And typically in these types of academies, it's at least 6 months of training. Now, other departments, because they can't afford a formalized academy training, will very often sponsor someone to go through a basic law enforcement training, such as is offered at Wake Tech, we call BLET. And during both of these, you'll be taught things like search, seizure, arrest, interrogation, weapons, all the basics of being a police officer. Learning the theoretical knowledge, you will then have the second component of your training, which is field training, and you will generally work under an FTO, a field training officer. This is a more senior officer who's had some experience, and he's going to kind of take you from the theoretical to the practical. Now, let's talk a little bit about women and minorities in policing today. Over the past 20 years, many police departments, including the Raleigh Police Department, Fayetteville, Durham, have attempted to recruit individuals to create a more balanced police department. And this can include recruiting African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, women, other minorities. Some of these minorities have innate characteristics like skin color or gender. Some have selective characteristics, or there might be some debate about that. This is in part because if you looked at law enforcement agencies prior to the 1970s, for example, if you looked at the Raleigh police agencies, even though Raleigh had a very significant minority community in the 1950s and 60s, the primary minority community in Raleigh would be black or African American. There were almost no black police officers. It took a long time. So gradually, as this was recognized as discrimination, the hiring was opened up. But there was a deficit of police officers who were women, who were minorities, or others. And via programs to increase this, active measures were taken to recruit more minorities into the police departments. All right, a little bit about gender, women working for police. Women tend to face greater scrutiny or examination. Many male police officers might feel that female police officers are not physically capable. Indeed, the sort of patriarchal attitude that women themselves are not fitted for a position of responsibility has very deep roots in Western culture. There also can be the belief that women or other minorities are hired as sort of tokenism, that we're just trying to fill a diversity slot and that's all that's important, and they're not real police officers. This, of course, can create pressure on women and minorities to prove them wrong. Most negative attitudes towards police women have very little factual support. There is almost no political data, there's almost no practical data that says that women police officers are worse than men. In fact, if there is any sort of benefit, we do tend to see female police officers not using force as readily as men do, de-escalating situations. Okay, as far as other minorities, there are significant issues. So we'll talk about primarily race minorities. And again, I have a few problems with using the term Hispanic as a racial term. I don't have a problem with it as using a linguistic term or minority term, but I think it's inexact. So I'm going to primarily we're going to examine this from a racial aspect and a little bit of the ethnicity aspect when we talk about Hispanics. Again, minority officers kind of have to walk the line. Minority racial officers or ethnic minority officers, so that the dominant white culture might believe that minority officers self-identify with those minorities against the police. So a white police officer might feel that a black police officer would give a black suspect more credit or more or favorable treatment. Conversely, minorities, racial minorities or ethnic minorities might feel that anybody that's putting on the uniform of the police is a traitor to that community and might be distrustful of them. So what's the benefit then of having a diverse police department? Well, part of it is the fact that as you have a more diverse police department, a police department that is representative of the population you're policing, your relations with that population will improve. A quick example would be of a problem of this would be in the investigation of crime. If you have no access to a subgroup in that society, it can be very difficult to investigate a crime. In the later half of the 20th century, there was a serial killer called BTK, Bind, Torture, Kill. And he preyed primarily in the homosexual community, but it was very difficult for the police to gain access to the homosexual community to investigate, to solve the crime, because they had such a hostile relationship with it. And the same could be true of other minorities. If a police department has poor relationships with let's suppose, a Vietnamese community in North Carolina, or an Asian community, a Korean community in California, if there's no officers that speak Korean, or if there's no officers that are the same racial group, it can be very difficult to solve crimes that are endemic inside that group. All right, public and private law enforcement. There are a little over 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States, and over 1 million people are employed by them. Not all are police officers, only about 900,000 or so. So there are people in support staffs. They operate really on 3 different levels. The local police departments, those would be the police, sheriff's departments, the state, which can be police like the Pennsylvania State Police or the Highway Patrol in North Carolina, and then the federal. And they can be all sorts of agencies like the FBI or the various Homeland Securities. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the municipal, the lower level. Most policing is done at the city and county level. So the city level, the municipal level, these would be small and medium-sized police departments. You might have a larger department like Raleigh or Durham that might have 600 or 700 officers, but the more common police department, maybe not in terms of total number, but number of officers, but in total numbers of department, would be a smaller one like Garner or Fuquay. They have very broad authority within their geographical distance, and since most Americans live in cities and towns and not in the country, these municipal police departments do most of the work. The other local level is the sheriff's department. So in North Carolina, the sheriffs are popularly elected. Each county in North Carolina, there's 100 counties, has 1 sheriff. They do investigate crime, but some of their more important duties as well is they maintain all the jails, which hold people pending trial or people convicted of misdemeanors. They carry out civil and criminal processing, which is serving both writs, writs of execution civilly, which isn't killing someone, it's collecting money. They keep order in the courthouse. So in North Carolina, the sitting district and superior courts have bailiffs, which are employees of the sheriff. They can be charged with collecting taxes. They also can enforce the orders of the court. Different states use county coroners who can be elected, medical examiners. These states vary very dramatically, and it's kind of beyond the scope of this course. But so, for example, North Carolina has a much different system than South Carolina, which has a different one than Virginia and New York. At the state level, we have really a couple options here. Some states, about half, 23 states, have a unified system. They have a state police system. Pennsylvania has a state police system. About 26 states, and that includes North Carolina, splits up their state level law enforcement. In North Carolina, we have a highway patrol, North Carolina Highway Patrol, and we have the State Bureau of Investigation, the SBI. Again, in some states, those are unified together. So in Pennsylvania, you have the Pennsylvania State Police. They would handle both roles. Here in North Carolina, we bifurcate or we split them. Federally, they're not a large percentage of law enforcement, but they're probably easily the most famous. So the central, and there was a lot of fight about this, Department for Enforcing Federal Laws starts with the Department of Homeland Security. I say there's a lot of fight about this because this comes about after 9/11, and after 9/11 there's really a desire to facilitate communication between these agencies, different federal agencies, and the thought was, let's put them all in one department under a secretary. Now, the premier federal agency is the FBI. And the FBI is controlled by the Attorney General of the United States, has been since forever. And the Attorney General of the United States, this is way back in the early 2000s, essentially objected to and fought the idea that you would incorporate the FBI into Homeland Security. So it remained outside, it remained in the Department of Justice. But a lot of the rest of these agencies all went under this new department. So you had U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, U.S. Immigration and Custom Enforcement, ICE, the Secret Service, the Coast Guard, although that can be moved out in times of war, TSA, Federal Emergency Management. The other major grouping of law enforcement, and this is separate from Homeland Security, is the Department of Justice. Head of this is the Attorney General of the United States. He works, he's appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate. Underneath him, you have still some very major and powerful federal agencies, and certainly the most famous, if not the largest in terms of numbers, if you looked at overall numbers of Homeland Security. The most famous is the FBI, and they lately have, as I said, been focusing a lot of effort into terrorism and drug trafficking, not so much some of the other stuff that they did in the 1960s and 70s. We have Drug Enforcement Administration, that's kind of self-explanatory, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, which is still just called ATF, the U.S. Marshal Service, which is one of the oldest, if not the oldest part of it. Besides the feds, the states, and the local, we've got private security. And private security is actually larger than the public. If there's about 1 million people that work for the public in municipal, county, or state, or federal, there's almost 2 million that work privately. And ideally, we would like to be able to coordinate these two things. But private security is not as dedicated to investigating crime. Its primary function is to deter crime, because instinctively people that hire private security, what they're interested in is not catching a bad guy that is stealing stuff, but preventing their stuff from getting stolen. Often we do see police officers doing private security, so it's very common in jurisdictions like Raleigh, where off-duty police officers will work in private security, sometimes even wearing their uniforms. Why do we have private security? Well, the public, again, has a fear of crime. And as we talked about in our first lectures, crime rates have actually been going down dramatically since the 1990s, but the public doesn't perceive this, so they actually want more and more. There is a problem of crime in the workplace. There is a budget cut and reductions of public policing. Public services cost money. Those money is funded by taxes. People don't like to pay taxes. The result is it's more cost efficient for the people that have money to actually pay private people than pay a higher tax. All right, let's talk a little bit about the federal law enforcement agencies. The Department of Treasury, DOT, one of their largest ones is the IRS. And it seems strange. When we think of the IRS, we think of, oh, well, they just collect taxes. But in fact, there is a sworn and armed part of the IRS that does criminal investigations. They look at things like tax fraud, tax evasion, and there can be very significant penalties associated with that as part of the Department of Treasury. Okay, well, that includes pretty much Chapter 4. And we'll pick up again, if you're following, with Chapter 5. We're still working on the police.